that's exactly what we want to try to do with the Weekly Ringer, and so I'm really glad that that's kind of a direct result. Now, here's what I want to change gears a little bit for next week. So, I was thinking about, as some of you have probably followed along, we've seen some of the first screens of the developer edition, at least, of Windows 8. Now, raise your hand out there. This is not the question, but raise your hand out there if you think it's probably way too early to be thinking of the 8th iteration of Windows, when the 7th iteration of Windows and then Vista before it probably came way too close to each other already, and we could really use some time to develop 7 a little bit more rather than developing an 8th. Okay, me, I think that. But maybe I'm just living in the past, which is exactly why I started thinking about living in the past in terms of the form and function of how we use our PCs. Now, we talked a few weeks ago about Steve Jobs and about his contributions to the world, and specifically with the desktop and the concept of the desktop. Now, what I want to ask about this is, if you've seen Windows 8, it does have a desktop interface, but it relies almost exclusively on a very kind of Windows Phone / Xbox Live dashboard look and feel, as opposed to a desktop. So here's what I want to ask you guys. It's been largely noted in many places that we're now living in the post-PC era. Now, rather than talk about that, which I think is debatable, but an interesting concept, here's what I want to ask you guys for the Weekly Ringer for next week. Are we witnessing the end of the desktop? So, not the desktop computer, you guys understand, but the desktop interface, as in the graphical user interface of the desktop, where you have the trash and you have the start menu and the taskbar, and whether you're talking about the Mac version, whether you're talking about the Linux version, whether you're talking about Windows, they all have their own desktop, right? Are we, with the advent of phones and the advent of all of these different operating systems that really function without a desktop, are we witnessing today, especially with our looking toward Windows 8, are we looking at the death of the desktop? So, I'm going to get back to my football game, which now happens to be the late game rather than the early game, but that's okay. I'll get back to it now. I'm glad to be watching football again, as I said before. Thanks for watching, as always, the Weekly Ringer. I am the Commodore from the Clan of the Grey Wolf. Can't see what you guys come up with for next week. There is no reset button. All right, 3rd and 10.